my own ancestry. By honoring my own ancestry as a descendant of the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico and the Pascua Yaqui people of the Southwest. And this land acknowledgement is something that we do not to perform faux allyship or to fetishize or to tokenize, but rather to pay deep and honest respect to the Indigenous family members among us. I'm offering this land and people's acknowledgement for several reasons. One, to communicate to the people native to this land that we recognize, respect, and appreciate your sovereignty, your self-determination, and your power. Two, because as a person who walks this earth, I continue to benefit from the richness of the land in all of its abundance. And three, because I understand that offering a land and Indigenous people's acknowledgement is a traditional practice that many tribal leaders call for. And four, because we can no longer stand by idly as government and the broader culture of this country actively seeks to erase the brilliance, power, beauty, and multidimensionality of Indigenous peoples whose mere existence proves to be an act of resistance. I'm coming to you today from the ancestral lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people. And in these words, I want to honor them, our ancestors, and the land that we're on. So thank you so much for that. Again, my name is Dr. Roberto Montoya. I use he, him, él, ello pronouns, and I'm honored to serve as the first ever Chief Educational Equity Officer for the state of Colorado and the Department of Higher Education. I get the distinct honor of leading the Office of Educational Equity here at the department, and we look to establish statewide policy. We act as facilitators of best practices, provide technical assistance, and we're really committed to ending the equity gaps that have persisted in this state for centuries. We're committed to promoting the public value of higher education and encouraging the general public to direct funding in a way that mirrors the diversity in our state and erases racial, ethnic, income equity gaps in Colorado. Nevertheless, it's an honor to be here in dialogue with you all, talking about teacher preparation, diversity, equity, and justice. And I specifically use the word dialogue because I define dialogue, as Paulo Freire does, as a process of thinking together. And this is inextricably different than communicating or being talked at, right? We will be thinking together this week. And as we have an opportunity to learn with and from each other about diversifying the educator workforce as an equity imperative in educator preparation. Together this week, we'll share and learn about high impact strategies that educator preparation programs use to foster a stable teaching profession that more accurately reflects the racial, ethnic, and linguistic diversity of our great state. I haven't the words to express how excited I am for our keynote speaker today and the breakout sessions this week. But before I introduce our speaker, I want to share with all of you a bit of my experience as a proud teacher educator. And I come out of a tradition of storytelling and testimonio. And I want to share with you one of my testimonios to frame and to animate why our work is vital and the importance of our dialogue this week and what we need to do in terms of a call to action. As we all know, the US population and our students have become more diverse, yet teacher demographics have done the inverse, becoming wider and less diverse. And so many students of color continually lack contact with teachers who share their ethnicity or who adequately recognize their racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. The scholars Ingersoll and May soberly declared that the minority teacher shortage is a civil rights issue. I'm going to say that again. What we're seeing in teacher education and lack of teacher diversity is a civil rights issue. I grew up in the barrios of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a majority Latinx state. I went to schools that were overwhelmingly filled with students who were either Chicano, Hispano, Native, Mexican, and Hispanic. I did not have a teacher that wasn't a shop or PE teacher who shared my gender and race until the second year of my doctoral work, Dr. Manuel Espinosa. And I share this because, as I just mentioned, this is not uncommon for far too many students of color in every state, including our own. And so what I want to share with you is some work that came out of my own dissertation. My dissertation focused inextricably on teacher diversity and the lack of Latino male PK through 12 educators. They make up less than 0.5% of all new teachers. And again, my own experience mirrors that. But what I want to share with you is a testimonial that reveals my journey away from and ultimately back to teaching. So come with me really quick as I share this testimony. It was late August and the year was 1997. I was 20 years old and a sophomore in college. And I remember this fall so vividly. The fall rains came early that year, and the quad of our small college was exceptionally verdant and ripe with the palpable excitement of a new semester. Despite this beauty and energy, in addition to getting my duplicitous disbursement check, I was bathed in conflict and uncertainty. I just returned from my summer in my cherished and marred Albuquerque, New Mexico, not knowing that that was the last time that I would be back for nearly 20 years for more than a short trip. However, what also troubled me was the confusing and painful conversations that I had during that last summer at home in Nuevo Mexico. I was struggling because I knew I had to come back to school and declare my major. And I felt so very conflicted regarding what I wanted to do and what I felt I needed to do. In my heart, I knew I wanted to teach. I wanted to be the educator I never had. I envisioned myself as the Chicano John Keating, the educator who inspired students with wit, charm, charisma, and unparalleled pedagogy. Instead of Robin Williams' character, it was me being carried off into teacher greatness, hoisted by my devoted and astute students. You see, that previous semester, I'd frequented the School of Education and perused the brochures countless times to grasp my coursework, what it would look like, student teaching, certification, and graduation requirements. Would I teach history, civics, English, or PE? To hell with physical education. I wanted to assign authors of colors, authors that were criminally denied to me during my PK through 12 schooling years. I dreamt of assigning Rudolfo Anaya, Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison, Sandra Cisneros, Du Bois, Rudolfo Acuna, and Frederick Douglass. All of these authors would come to me via the gift of Chicano and ethnic studies courses, elective syllabi that generally saved my life. But these courses also enraged me. I was livid because they made evident how very limited my reading lists were to this point, and that so many of those gifted and talented students that were in those ever elusive and overwhelmingly white AP classes had most likely read and had access to these amazing authors. It wouldn't be for another quarter century before I would be introduced to Albert Meme, Michel Foucault, Charles Mills, Derek Bell, Bell Hooks, Fanon, and James Baldwin. I wanted to be an opener of minds, a cultivator of curiosity. Over the summer of 1997, this enthusiasm was ultimately sucked dry, left as dehydrated as the Albuquerque summer that also tormented me that year. You see, over that summer, I shared my desire to become a high school teacher with my mother, only to be met with, por favor, no, mijo. Please, no, son. I tried all summer tirelessly to convince my mother and my family that this was a good choice for a career, an honorable decision. Nevertheless, my mother, who lived her entire life in concentrated and suffocating poverty, simply could not reconcile that I would become a teacher. Like so many parents of color, she saw higher education as a gateway to a higher salary and to generational wealth. Even though she never finished high school, she knew very well that teachers were not paid well and that I would likely struggle due to this decision. My mother begged me to become a medical doctor, business owner, or lawyer like my aunt, who went to Harvard and was a law professor. I argued with her that money is not everything. James Baldwin once wrote that anyone who's ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. My mom knew this, and I knew this. And as my mom took the offensive during the latter part of the summer, she reminded me of the traumatic struggles we had due to not having very much money. Frequenting food pantries, having our lights cut off every other month, boiling hot water for baths, and the crushing carousel at Section 8 housing. She begged me to declare a major that would allow me to get out of this cycle, that would afford us a way out of it. The more she lobbied and reminded me of our trauma, the further my dreams of becoming Jaime Escalante drifted. I remember struggling daily as I vacillated between familial responsibility and doing what I wanted to do with my life and education. However, in my family, culture, and home, responsibility is not so easily discarded, and Mexican mom guilt is formidable and potent. I declared a major in political science to prepare myself for law school and the riches that would undoubtedly follow. It would take me nearly 25 years to make my way back to teaching. Ultimately, I never made it to law school despite taking the LSAT and being accepted. The amazing gift that is a child, a young daughter, delayed and demanded that I find work that included medical, dental, and a steady salary. She's now a junior at CU Boulder and is simply the best of all of us. I worked in the private sector for over a decade before being laid off during the Great Recession. And I'm so thankful that I lost my job during that time. And in saying that, I don't mean to be trite nor minimizing. So many people were devastatingly impacted in 2008. Yet for me, this unemployment enabled me to go back to school, as many people did during this time. I pursued the graduate degree, the one that I had been putting off because of the endless work and decent salary. And despite my gainful employment, I was eroding and regressing and felt unbelievably uninspired. I felt renewed and reinvigorated as a result of losing my job. And I decided to get a master's in ethnic studies, and I knew that I was going directly into a PhD program, teaching in the School of Education. And I've always felt very guilty and a bit conflicted about teaching pre-service educators not having a formal PK through 12 classroom teaching experience. And this lack of experience was appropriately, albeit deficitly, highlighted during my doctoral application process. During my admission interview, I was asked just what gave me the audacity to apply to a PhD program in education, teaching future teachers without a formal teaching background, and as what was said, a formal pedagogy. And I found the framing and the line of this questioning curious and belittling. Curious because the scholar asking the question cited the work of Paulo Freire in their own scholarship. And both the scholar and Freire emphasized the need for us to divorce ourselves from the banking notions of education, that somehow students are empty reciprocals, we make deposits and withdrawals, and that's what learning is. We know that students come with vast epistemologies, ways of knowing and knowledge. But also the declaration that I had an unsubstantiated pedagogy was belittling because the way that I saw it and what I was asked to teach and research in, which was the social foundations of race and racism in schools, I saw that I had a really fully formed pedagogy in this area. I'd been teaching white educators my whole life about how to interact with and learn from students of color. I saw myself as having a pedagogy that was honed over 3 decades. I also conveyed that my research began in utero, as my mother experienced racism and harassment for not speaking English well and for being labeled as hypofertile because I had sisters. My earliest memories of being othered are of being othered in schools and by governmental systems. I knew that I was an expert in race and racism. I had the lived experience and the research experience to add value to the program. Nevertheless, it was these types of experiences that always made my teaching in higher education feel like it was different, not as valid because I didn't teach PK through 12 students. I genuinely believe that the feelings of inadequacy were heightened because I felt regret about not declaring to teach way back in 1997. I share this because my experience is not unfamiliar and it's so anchored to so much of what we're trying to do. In trying to diversify the teacher demographics in this state, we also have to reframe within families that teaching is an honorable profession. So much of what we think of teachers is anchored to salary. And that's real because students who come out with crushing student loan debt, teaching becomes very difficult because of the salary. Right? We also need to think of schools in the way that current in-service teachers talk about the profession itself. So much of my dissertation research came out of students talking about how their teachers would really belittle the profession, and that many of them wanted to become teachers as a form of resistance capital, to be the teachers that they never had. But they also talked about the deep importance of their teacher preparation programs and how many of them were lacking of actually anchoring any of their own lived experiences, knowledges, and cultures and languages within that said program. So it's not just looking at diversifying the teacher force, but also thinking about and being self-reflective of how we are preparing our own teachers and what our preparation programs look like themselves. But beyond that, how do we continue to retain great teachers, especially teachers of color, and do so centering dignity? And this is the work that we are up against right now. And we have known this for some time, right? We know the data has shown, we have seen many reports. We will talk about the research and data this week. But what feels different for me is that we are at a time right now where normalizing conversations of equity and justice are being done so in a way that I have never experienced in my 20+ year career. For me, there feels like there is a commitment to action. Before, roles like mine didn't necessarily exist. And for me to be in this role, to work with so many amazing scholars, educators, practitioners, community members, students, families, it feels different. And that's why our time together is so incredibly important. And with that, it's a beautiful segue to talk about our keynote speaker today, who is committed to not only addressing, but changing the demographics of the teaching profession. She goes far beyond simply talking about the insidiousness and inequities of teacher diversity. She's a committed scholar, practitioner, and leader, and focuses on praxis. I'm honored to call her femtor, colleague, advisor, and friend, Dr. Margarita Bianco. So happy to have you here. Dr. Bianco is an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, and the founder of Pathways to Teaching. She created the program based on her years of research, coupled with her own personal experience as a first-generation student, a Latina woman, and a classroom teacher for more than 20 years. Dr. Bianco's work has been published in leading educational journals, including Theory into Practice, the Journal of Negro Education, the Urban Review, Urban Education, Teacher Education and Special Education, the Journal of Hispanics in Higher Education, on and on. Dr. Bianco is the recipient of multiple awards based on her effort to diversify the teacher workforce through Grow Your Own program development. She was named the Timmer House Teaching Ambassador representing the University of Colorado. She recently won the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, AACTE, 2020 Teacher Diversity Research Award, was recognized by Diverse Issues in Higher Education as one of the top 35 women in higher education who are making a difference. It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Bianco as our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, good. Roberto, thank you so much. Dr. Montoya, thank you so much for that introduction. It's really an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this will work okay. Let me see who can share, all participants. So it's not letting me share at the moment. Let's see, here we go. Okay. And give me 1 minute. I'm using a new program here. So I'm going to present. Here we go. You can all see my screen, I hope. Yes. So the title of my talk is around looking at diversifying the educator workforce from an equity perspective. And again, I'm really honored to be here, and a special thank you to Drs. Roberto Montoya and Brittany Lane for inviting me to participate in this conversation. Both I've known Roberto and Brittany for a long time. And Roberto, I'm so proud of you and the work that you're doing. So kudos to you and thanks for the invite. Excuse me. So I'm really pleased and honored to be part of this kickoff for this event this week. You have a fabulous lineup. And some of what I'm going to be talking about really kind of blends everything together. So in looking at the program, you're going to be talking about how the role of leadership in maintaining a diverse educator workforce, faculty diversity and the impact on students, and supporting diverse aspiring teachers. And then Friday, talking about education as a fundamental right. And I'm really looking forward to all of these presentations. So I'm hoping to join as much as I can this week, and I hope that all of you will return for those as well. As Dr. Montoya mentioned, my work is really influenced by who I am and my multiple identities. And I identify as multiracial, Puerto Rican, Latina. I'm the first in my family to graduate from high school. I almost dropped out of high school many times. And I needed to learn how to navigate harsh environments. So as Dr. Montoya alluded to, school is not always a very welcoming place for students of color, and certainly that was my experience. So I became a teacher so I could be the teacher I never had. And again, I heard Dr. Montoya say something similar. And this is not a unique sentiment for me or for Roberto, but you can speak to many teachers of color and you'll hear the same thing in terms of being the teacher so that we can come back and change those systems. I was a classroom teacher for more than 20 years before going back and getting advanced degrees. And in these spaces, I always want to honor my ancestors for the sacrifices they made to make today possible for me. So I am celebrating 48 years as an educator. Started as a para-educator, classroom teacher, general special education teacher, taught ESL, EFL, gifted ed, and then teacher preparation programs for the last 15 or 16 years. So I love teaching, and teaching is definitely part of my identity, and it's part of what I do every day in inspiring young people to become a teacher. So I have two students with me, and I'll introduce them quickly, and then I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But they are shining star examples of what a successful Grow Your Own program can produce. So we have with us today Ms. Jocelyn Garcia Moreno and Ms. Nu Vo. Both of these young women were students in the Pathways to Teaching program, and both of them are now students at CU Denver. So Jocelyn, why don't you go first and introduce yourself, and then Nu, if you will introduce yourself too. And then I just want to say that throughout the presentation, I'm going to ask them to participate. I'm going to ask them questions here and there and have them respond, so that student voice really is important here. So Jocelyn, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hola, buenos días a todos. I'm Jocelyn Garcia Moreno. Like Dr. Bianco, I was also a first generation student. I'm a first generation of Mexican American. I'm the daughter of two Mexican immigrants from Durango, Mexico. I am a proud Latina, Hispanic, and I am really passionate about the work that Dr. Bianco is doing regarding teaching. I think that we can all speak to the experiences that we've had in teaching within teaching and education, and as students of color going through a system that wasn't really built for us. And so I was also part of the Pathways to Teaching program, like Dr. Bianco said, and it just truly inspired me to continue this path of social justice and speaking up for those who have been in our position. And I'm speaking to everyone who is a person of color that has experienced all those inequalities that are around not only the educational system, but everywhere else. I am a graduate student. I graduated in May with my bachelor's in mathematics, hoping to become a math teacher, high school math teacher, and I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Also to know, Jocelyn is a graduate student now with us to be a secondary math teacher, as she said, but we're also working on getting her into our EDD program. So she will soon be here with us having a doctorate degree. And Nu is a student who graduated from high school last year, and she's an undergrad with us. And I should mention too that both Jocelyn and Nu work with me in the Pathways to Teaching program, supporting teachers and students around the country. So Nu, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Sure thing. Hello, so my name is Nu Vo. I am a recent high school graduate who completed the Pathways to Teaching program myself. I'm attending the University of Colorado, Denver, majoring in human development and family relations with hopes to actually work in higher education one day. My experience with Pathways to Teaching really enhanced and solidified my passion to work in education, especially considering opportunity gaps, achievement gaps, and just educational inequities that I also experienced. And it was through Pathways to Teaching that I learned about it and deconstructed my experiences, and also just wanting to work in education to be a role model and be a faculty of color or a teacher of color for Asian American students who don't have that representation. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Nu. So you'll be hearing from both Jocelyn and Nu again throughout the presentation this morning. Let's see, go to the next slide. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so for the topics that I'm going to talk about this morning, I'm going to offer lots of questions to consider. Things that you could talk to your faculty about in meetings, or just things to consider through this presentation and through the week. I'm going to do some context and framing around educator diversity and equity and the challenges that many of our institutions face. I'll talk about the Colorado landscape, and then we're going to end up with a video that'll introduce you to pathways to teaching. And again, I'll ask Jocelyn and Nu to help us understand better the student voice. So before I forget, I have a number of resources to share with you, and I think Brittany put them in the chat box in a Google folder. So there are several reports, and I'm just going to go over what it is I shared so you know. So first, I included a new Kaplan report. It just came out, building a more ethno-racially diverse teacher force. And it really is highlighting the chapters in a book that's published by AERA that'll come out in the spring. The editors of the book and of this section in Kaplan is Dr. Travis Bristol and Conrad Gist. Amazing young scholars, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to participate in this book by co-editing the section on recruitment. Two other reports. One is Keeping Up with the Kids. This was a report that was commissioned by CDE a number of years ago, and it has some really valuable information about what the state can do moving forward. And another report done by Dr. Sharon Bailey, commissioned by Denver Public Schools, really looking at inequities in DPS, and especially focusing on Black and African American teachers in DPS. And I'll talk more about both of these reports later. But first, a shout out to CDE especially, so trying to get data in Colorado around teacher demographics and student demographics is relatively easy. That's not the case for most states when I'm looking for data. So making sure that it's really transparent in terms of student and teacher demographic data is really important. So shout out to Colorado for doing that. So here are a few things that I want to think about moving forward. Context and framing, both at the national and state level. When we talk about recruitment, when we talk about retention, when we talk about diverse teacher diversity and P12 settings, as well as college and university, all of that is really very interrelated. And the impact on students, all of us as educators should always be thinking first about the impact on students and how equitable is our institution. So why is educator diversity and equity imperative? And so what's your why? So I really, this is something that I do want you to think about throughout the week, throughout this morning, but to continue these conversations in your place of employment. This is something that I've been giving a lot of thought to lately. What's the role of allyship in creating a diversified workforce? So allyship training is something that's often overlooked in diversity trainings, but something that I think is hugely important. I think that our allies need to know what an ally does and what an ally can do to really support the work, but not perpetuate some of the inequities. So for example, there are people that I know, colleagues, who believe themselves to be really strong allies, but instead what they do is try to stand in and take my voice and try to interpret my voice, which is not what I need in an ally. I need somebody to stand beside me, not in front of me. So anyway, another thing to think about in terms of what is the role of allyship. And here are just a couple of my pet peeves. And I think that Dr. Montoya alluded to this before, but so all of us have our strategic plans and our vision and mission statements. And most of these strategic plans and statements include something about diversifying the workforce, diversifying their institution. but there's never any accountability associated with the statement. So I'd like for you to examine your statements and make sure that there's a sense of accountability and also some transparency to let people know whether you're meeting those goals. And this is especially true for higher education. So just a reminder that we're not a checkbox, that we really need to have some accountability about doing the things we say, and to talk about the diversification of the educator workforce from a value added perspective. And then the other pet peeve I have is looking at your internet sites and your social media presence. So is your faculty and student body as diverse as the images on your social media? Or are these images where you want to go and what you want to be? And that's fine, but then say it, because oftentimes then you're misrepresenting your institution if what you see is a great deal of photos of faculty of color and students of color, but when students get there, they don't see that. So just to be honest and let us know what you're representing. So those are just a few of my pet peeves. I have a lot more, but those are the only two I'm going to talk about right now. When we talk about wanting to increase the student and faculty diversity in our teacher prep programs, the other question we really have to ask ourselves is, are we prepared for them? So are we really prepared to serve the students that we're wanting to invite into our programs? And are we really ready to support faculty? Faculty of color in our program. So the equity imperative is not just about the numbers, it's about how we're going to support people to be successful. It's not about the numbers. So in case you didn't hear me, just to be clear, it's not just about the numbers. Teacher diversity must be viewed and accepted as central to any discussion on the quality of education for all students. So, when we talk about increasing teacher diversity in P12 settings, we have to recognize that teachers of color help close the achievement and opportunity gaps for students of color, particularly in high poverty environments. Teachers of color bring with them some unique knowledge, lived experience. They want to role model, they want to mentor students. These are the reasons that they entered the teacher workforce to begin with. And we've got so much research, and especially a lot of research that's coming out in the last decade, that talks about the impact that having just one teacher of color can have on graduation rates and grade point averages. So, there's a lot of added benefit to having teachers of color working with students of color, but also for white students too. So this is a question that really guides my work and really speaks to the equity imperative. So what messages are students of color receiving regarding the authority of knowledge and legitimacy of power when students experience school with a predominantly white teacher workforce? I want to sit with that for a minute regarding the authority of knowledge and legitimacy of power. And then what message does this convey to white students as well? So this is where I see the equity imperative most strongly. So we're going to listen to a student. Her name is Nadia. She was a student in the Pathways to Teaching program a number of years ago. And I think this was at Montbello High School. And she's going to talk about what it felt like to not have Latina teachers. So let's listen to Nadia.
So going off of what Mario said, I think that teachers of color connect more with students of color because they feel that special bond there that can help you and that can be another role model in school and in your house. I never had a Latina teacher, and it makes me feel like I would never be someone good enough. I would like to be a teacher, but then again, it's like I never see a Latino teacher, so it's like, how is my life going to be as a teacher if I never seen a Latina teacher actually teach someone a class or something? So I would be afraid, but I think teachers just have to encourage you.
So Nadia said a lot in just that minute, right? And so typically when I do these talks in person, I like to do breakout groups and let us unpack the kinds of things that Nadia said. But just to sum it up, I mean, she talked about, that authority of knowledge and power in terms of not feeling like she had the power by not seeing people who look like her in those positions of power. Whoops. Next, we're going to listen to a Pathways to Teaching discussion. This one was at Collegiate Prep Academy in DPS. That young man that you see in the middle, JJ, he is currently working in a preschool and has been teaching in preschool for a number of years. This video is just a typical conversation that was taking place in class one day that I took my iPhone out and started to videotape. So listen to the young folks talk about the impact of teachers of color.
Teaching white students, those things from a whole different perspective. There's so much in our culture as well as Hispanic culture about us that people don't know. And it's a big reason why we can't get along as races, because we just don't know who you guys are. You guys don't know who we are. So as a Black person teaching white students, what was the name of the article that we read? And it was a student talking about how he had a Black instructor of color, and it made him see things from a whole different perspective.
Why are you want to keep going?
Why is that? Yeah, I don't know. I think having white students, it's going to help them be able to be more globally aware, if that makes sense. They're aware of what's around them and they're not afraid of what's around them, if that makes sense. Because the stereotypes that we have of big thugs, drug dealers, gangbangers, prostitute strippers, and seeing a Black person that made it is able to bring you something new to the table, something new that we can put on your platter. It's helping you become globally aware, comfortable with other races.
Honestly, all you're getting from people of color in the school is their janitorial service. They work in the kitchen making your lunch. You know, it's things like that. It's like our coaches for athletics. It's like, if I see a person of color in a teacher position, it's like, wow, this person is intelligent. They're, feeding me this information. They're bringing these ideas to the table, as opposed to, oh, well, that's my coach. He teaches me how to play basketball, or that's the lunch lady. She knows how to put food on my tray. So when I see people that look like me in that kind of head position, that's kind of giving me what I'm going to use for the rest of my life, it impacts you a lot more.
Yeah, instead of promoting diversity, we are showing diversity in that. I mean, that's a big problem. That's why I have a problem with Stevie Butler. I know you teach jail.
No, that's it. Don't go back. Don't go back.
We promote so much diversity. Like, we want diverse students, and we have a diverse population, but we don't have it, and that's the reality. And they're not offering it to diverse students either. They're just promoting that they have it, but that's what they want, but they're not fully gaining. And so instead of promoting diversity, let's be a part of making diversity in education. If that makes sense.
So again, JJ and Angel and the other students, they're talking about, that legitimacy of power and knowledge again. So from the equity perspective, what messages are we sending to students? Okay, let me move my slide. Okay, so similar to Angel, similar to what Roberto said earlier, I went through K-12, went through bachelor's degree, doctorate degree, and I still have never had a Latina or Latino instructor. So the only Latinas that I experienced in school were serving food and cleaning toilets. So those were my models in terms of what Latina women could achieve in school, right? So I want you to pay attention. So that image there of the Colorado flag, or image that we have that represents Colorado, I'm going to show you something in a minute that's interesting, but the Colorado landscape. So similar to around the country, a student can go from pre-K to PhD, and it's likely that a Colorado student may never have a teacher of color. Now let's look at that image again. So if I take the data from Colorado teacher demographics, and I put them into a donut chart, that is what comes out. So we didn't know it, but our symbol represents what we have in terms of teacher demographics in the state. 87% of our Colorado teachers are white, and we can see the racial demographics that break down, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So Colorado, again, 80% of our teachers are white, 48% of Colorado students are racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse. 8% of Colorado teachers are Latina, Latinx, 34% of Colorado students are Latinx. It's the fastest growing demographic population in the state. Only 1.6% of Colorado teachers are Black or African American, and that actually represents a decrease 5% of Colorado students are Black or African American. And let's just look at Denver public schools as an example. So a different way to represent these data, but DPS students, we have, over half of the DPS students are Latinx, with 25% of DPS's students being white. And teachers, again, our teachers are mostly white in DPS, with fewer Latino and African American and Asian and Native American representation. So 73% of Colorado school districts do not have a single Black educator. 33% of districts don't have a single Latinx educator. Again, these are national demographics: 79% teachers white, 9% Latinx, 7% Black African American, and so on, but less than 2% of the national demographics of males of color, so less than 2%. Same data represented differently for those of you that need a visual graph. 40% of schools in the United States don't have or don't employ a single teacher of color, 40%. So as we all know, we are in the midst of a huge teacher shortage, teacher crisis shortage, and teacher-student diversity gap. So these are crises that are actually worsening now with the pandemic. We have a new report that just came out from the Learning Policy Institute examine the number of teachers that are leaving because of COVID. So new teachers, and I've spoken to a few that their very first year of teaching was last year. Can you imagine, what a horrible way to introduce teachers to the profession with all the stress and anyway, so new teachers are leaving and said, this isn't what I signed up for, and other teachers are retiring before planned. We have a crisis around recruitment. Fewer students of color are interested in becoming teachers, and retention, teachers of color are leaving the profession at higher rates. So our national demographic has shown an increase in the Latino teacher population. However, and people are getting excited about that, as they should. However, if you look at the data, Latino teachers are also leaving the profession at higher rates. So while we might get a few more in the recruitment part, we're losing them. So it's not just about growing your own teachers, it's also about keeping your own teachers, right? So we have to really focus on retention, because that's where some of the real challenges have been. So let's look at some of the issues around retention. So teachers of color experience greater job dissatisfaction and higher turnover rates. And what contributes to this, right? So we're seeing this all over, not just in Colorado, but all over the country. So one of the things that we can look at closely is the same systems of oppression that push students of color out of school are also pushing teachers of color out too. So the daily microaggressions that students experience, teachers are experiencing them. Biased assessments, both in terms of student achievement data, but also in terms of teacher data. Institutional racism, racist policies and practices. So these are issues that are pushing students out, but they're also pushing teachers of color out. I mentioned the Bailey report earlier. So if you take a look at that report, one of the things that Dr. Bailey did was interview teachers, administrators, and community members around the climate for Black, African, and African American teachers. And here's one of the things that she found, but also this mirrors the national data around why teachers of color are leaving the profession. Racism, leaving the profession or being unsatisfied in their job site. So racism, antagonistic school culture, they're undervalued, silenced, and ignored. They're deprived of agency and autonomy, feeling powerless. That brown and Black tax, which we're going to talk about in a minute too, feeling isolated with no community, lack of support for culturally relevant or socially just teaching. Ask any teacher of color that you know, and they can relate to all of this or at least some of it. And this also goes for higher ed. So this isn't just pre-K through high school. This is a particularly powerful quote that came from the Bailey report, and I'll read it to you. African Americans in DPS are invisible, silenced, and dehumanized, especially if you're passionate, vocal, and unapologetically Black. We can't even be advocates for our kids. It feels a lot like being on a plantation. There's a fear, and Black folks are pitted against each other. So this is just one of many quotes that illustrated the experience for Black and African American teachers in DPS. I've talked to Dr. Bailey a number of times about this report, and one of the things that I know is that if this report were replicated around the country, so you would hear the same kinds of statements, not just from Black teachers, but from Asian American teachers, from Latinx teachers, Native American, and so on. So what about higher education, right? So what about faculty of color? How different is it? I naively assumed that when I got to higher ed, that things would be different than my public school teaching. And I was quite surprised. So what's the relationship between recruiting and retaining faculty of color and increasing student diversity? So higher ed folks were always looking to increase diversity in our teacher prep programs, but look at your faculty. So what's that relationship between having faculty of color in your teacher prep programs and being able to increase the representation of minoritized students in your program? So one of the things we know from research and my own experience, and I'm going to have New and Jocelyn speak to this in a minute, but students of color and first generation students follow people, not programs. So you can have a program that, you know, is lauded in the newspaper of being an amazing teacher prep program. But if you don't have faculty that know the students in the community and go out to the high schools and really, you know, talk about teaching as a fabulous profession and one that they're dedicated to, why they entered the field. So if faculty are not getting to know students closely, you're not going to have them coming to your program regardless of how good your program is. Students of color and first generation students are looking and they're in search of community, of guidance, validation, understanding, and healing. And they'll be able to get those things more readily from faculty of color that they feel like they know and they trust. So Jocelyn, I'm going to have you go first and talk about this in terms of why you picked CU Denver and the relationship and how you got to know faculty and doctoral students and how that influenced your decision. And then New, I'm going to have you address the same thing too. Go ahead, Jocelyn.
Yeah, this speaks heavily to me. When I was in high school, I always seeked opportunities to advance in my education. So I was part of a lot of programs, specifically through CU Denver, because those programs focusing on recruiting students of color into higher ed. So that spoke to me. And then when I was a senior and I was actually researching where to go to college, I looked up the statistics and I figured out that CU Denver had the highest Latinx community, which to me was really important. I didn't want to be a first generation student with no one to help me at the college. And so I knew Dr. Bianco was at CU Denver and a lot of the other folks from the other programs that I joined, and it was such a game changer for me. Just knowing that I had someone that I could speak to that understood what I was going through, just in terms of college, because college, as we all know, it's scary when you first get into college. It's scary when no one is there to help you. You know, my parents, I love them to death, but they didn't really know how to help me because they don't speak English. They never went through that process. So I kind of made Dr. Bianco my educational mom, as I call her, because she was there to guide me. And it makes such a difference in the way that I experienced college, I believe. I just think that it's powerful to know that even though there might be better quote unquote programs out there, like educational programs, because I knew that I was going into teaching, that is just numbers, because what counts is that there's people in there willing to help you get through those programs and support you and see you as a person, not just as another number in the statistics.
Great. Thank you, Jocelyn. Nu, you want to speak to this as well?
Yeah, so to add on to that, I would definitely say it's really the connections with people that really influenced my decision to come to UCD. And it was through being connected with faculty of color, being in programs like Jocelyn. And it was also through connections with Dr. Bianco and Dr. Tandon, who I had connections with. And it was really being connected to also other students of color that I knew were coming to UCD. It was like it was diversity in the program, but also diversity in the student body and the faculty that really influenced my decision to come here. And it was with that they also really encouraged and supported first-gen students, and the School of Education particularly have a lot of programs and teachers who dedicate and commit their time to supporting first-year and first-gen students.
Thanks so much, Nu. I appreciate it. So one of the things that we do in Pathways to Teaching is we talk about intergenerational mentorship, and you're actually witnessing this today. So Jocelyn has been at CU Denver a couple of years. Nu, this is her first year, so I make sure that I'm pairing them together. And so Jocelyn is now mentoring Nu, and Jocelyn has been mentored by doctoral students. So anyway, it's intergenerational mentoring, which is hugely important for students of color to make sure that they're successful in their programs. At the intersections of race, class, gender, and other isms. So faculty of color have a lot of stress and tensions, constant microaggressions, both from colleagues and students. Again, this was so new to me, even though I was an older, new faculty, I really assumed that in higher ed, I was not going to have to deal with so much of this anymore. But at one of the institutions where I worked, a colleague jokingly, quote, jokingly called me a mutt as I talked to her about my multiracial identity. And she thought it was kind of funny, and everybody at the table thought it was funny. Well, it wasn't so funny for me. But that's just one example of many, many, many that I've had, as well as other faculty of color. I've been asked, why am I so aggressive? Well, all I did was ask a question, so if you're asking questions, or if you're challenging something in a faculty meeting, for example, especially women of color are perceived as being aggressive. A student once thought I was part of the janitorial staff at CU Denver. So these are things that happen a lot. So they're not isolated incidents. Faculty of color are also in search of community and solidarity. Similar to students, we're looking for that too. And that tenure process really becomes even more challenging for faculty of color when you're thinking about one of the other resources is a really important report that was done by faculty at University of Texas at Austin. And in particular, they were looking at promotion, tenure, pay, and racial climate for Latinx faculty there. And what they found was, I'll quote, they presented evidence of inequities in pay, representation, and leadership, and argued that these constitute bias and discrimination against Hispanic employees. Highly recommend that you read this report. This report serves as a blueprint for the kind of report that I think every higher ed institution in the state of Colorado and the country should do in terms of looking at a diverse faculty as, is it equitable for them? And so I have actually sent this report to our admins at CU Denver and have recommended that this serve as a blueprint so that we can disaggregate this data by race, ethnicity, and gender and expand it to all faculty. That Black and brown tax, so serving, faculty of color, often serving on search committees disproportionately, doing all the diversity work, mentoring students. So I mentor literally hundreds of students, many of them at CU Denver, high school students, but also I get calls and emails from students around the country, Latinx students from universities around the country seeking my help to help mentor them through either junior faculty mentoring them through tenure and promotion, or graduate students. Those are the kinds of things that we can't count and put on our CV. So it's the kind of work that we're doing all the time anyway. So again, throughout higher education, Black and brown women are often dismissed, overlooked, ignored, misunderstood, and often perceived as aggressive and hostile. And I think if you speak to, women of color in higher ed, you'll see that this is a similar story that runs through all of our programs. Here are 3 resources if you want to take a picture of your screen. There are more, many, many more, but these are 3 that were on my bookshelf that I refer to often. But these are really excellent books that talk about faculty diversity and the kinds of things you can do to strengthen in your programs. So again, supporting a diverse student body means increasing the representation of faculty of color and then supporting your faculty through promotion and tenure. So, creating a campus where everybody feels welcomed and valued, students, faculty, is everybody's responsibility. It's not just the responsibility of your, ethnically diverse faculty on the diversity committee to examine the climate and to examine what we're doing to make everybody feel welcome. It's everybody's responsibility. So a few things that higher ed can do in terms of supporting faculty of color is just providing some mentoring programs. And this has to really be differentiated mentoring, because faculty of color, junior faculty of color, need different things than white faculty of color. There are different things that we need to understand and navigate, especially for those of us who are first gen. I am still first gen, and I still am in conversations with colleagues who had, their parents were professors. Well, mine weren't. And so they knew how to navigate this tenure system way better than I did. So faculty of color really do need differentiated mentoring. Provide training. This is huge. So for faculty of color, where our scholarship is often centered on diversity and inclusion and studying groups that are historically marginalized or underrepresented, we need to make sure that those people who are on the promotion and tenure committees receive training around how this work is really legitimate and rigorous. And so anyway, I could go on and on about this, but we need to make sure that people who are evaluating us are also trained in these issues. Guard against overburdening faculty of color with responsibilities, especially around diversity committee. As soon as we have a new faculty of color, we put them on the diversity committee. Well, it's not their responsibility to be teaching everybody about stereotypes and biases, right? So it's not just their responsibility, and that adds an undue burden on them. Now, when we think about, our teacher prep programs, and we finally have students of color in our teacher prep programs, and then what happens? They leave. Why? They're feeling isolated. They're being othered. The curriculum doesn't reflect them or their experiences. Their deficit perspectives of the communities of color that they're going to be teaching in or that they grew up in, right? The lack of faculty of color to mentor them. But that 4th bullet about deficit perspectives is huge. I've had more than one, pre-service teacher candidate come to me and talk, not just at CU Denver, but at other institutions that I work with or where I mentor students, where they say, they're getting us ready to do our internship in this community, and they're talking about this community in such a deficit way. I'm afraid to let them know that that's where I came from. So we have this deficit perspective that we need to challenge. Teacher education curriculum. And I think Dr. Montoya referred to this before also. The focus has been preparing on white teachers to work with diverse students. So where do pre-service teachers of color fit into the curriculum? So we're centering whiteness in teacher prep programs, and that is part of our problem in terms of recruiting and retaining students in our program. So I would challenge you to ask yourself with every decision, am I centering whiteness, and if so, how? Admissions decisions, hiring practices, how you're changing your curriculum, the assessments, the assignments that you're offering to your students. field experiences, and I mentioned this a moment ago, but there's a horror story that I'll share. So how do you introduce your pre-service teachers to the communities that they're going to be working in? How are families represented, and how is the community introduced? So I knew of a teacher prep program that used to introduce pre-service teachers to the communities where they were going to do their internship by taking a tour of the community in a police car. And the police talked about where the crack houses were, where you can find the prostitutes, where the meth houses were. And that's how students were introduced to this community where they were going to teach. And for some of the pre-service teachers of color, that was the community that they came from. So what message is being sent to pre-service teachers? So I want you to examine the curriculum, make sure that you're including subject matter, scholarship, and critical lenses by and about people of color. Again, Dr. Montoya referred to this earlier. You know, who are the people that you're having students read? In the Pathways to Teaching curriculum, for example, I make sure that students do assignments where they study and learn about faculty of color around the country. And we talk about it in terms of you can't be who you don't see. And on our website, I have several digital stories that were created by Jocelyn, as a matter of fact, in terms of introducing students to teachers of color and faculty of color around the country. One of the things I'd like to leave you, well, not leave you with now, but something that I want you to think about is another way to introduce students to the communities that they're going to be working in. And Dr. Tara Yoso has a fabulous article called Whose Culture Has Capital? A Critical Race Theory Discussion of Community Cultural Wealth. And I use this article with high school students when we talk about examining the communities that they live in and that they'll work in. But also, I think faculty need to introduce this to their pre-service teachers as a way to present community from a strength-based perspective. And one assignment that I have students do is, when for my undergrad classes at CU and my grad classes, is have my students walk the community looking for elements of cultural wealth in the community versus that tour in a police car. Okay, so despite all the obstacles, there's no better time to be a teacher, and people look at me like I'm nuts when I say this, but for me, we are under attack. Higher ed folks are under attack. We can't talk about critical race theory. We can't talk about comments that make some, students feel uncomfortable. There is no better time to be a teacher and no better time to encourage young people to be teachers. We need to model what fighting for educational equity looks like and to nurture the next generation of equity warriors. And that's what I think about every day when I wake up and I'm teaching my pre-service courses or working on the curriculum for Pathways to Teaching. Despite the horrors right now, it's the best time to become a teacher. And with that, I'm just going to have Jocelyn and New chime in again, and then we're going to watch a 5-minute video about Pathways to Teaching and open it up for question and answer. So Jocelyn, do you want to say anything to kind of wrap up? And then New, let's start with you this time. You have something you want to say to kind of wrap up the topics for today?
Yeah, so I feel like Pathways to Teaching, especially going through the program myself, is really theory into practice and encouraging and recruiting students of color to become teachers of color. Especially through I took all 3 courses, and the most impactful course for me was the Introduction to Socially Just Ed, where I was learning about educational inequalities that were directly impacting my education, and I was able to connect to that. And I feel like Pathways to Teaching is a course where students of color can connect and relate and also be promoted to change makers. It was through the program that I also really learned a lot about effective teaching, about diversity, and especially through the field experience where I was able to go within my community to see where how it is infecting generations of students. Yeah, and I really love this program. I love what it stands for, and I love what the impact it has on students and teachers across the nation.
Thank you, New. Jocelyn, you want to wrap us up here?
Yeah, I just want to say too, everyone that wants to create change within our teacher workforce for our students, because that's eventually why we're doing it, for students in the country, for the future of the country. It's important to understand that these are hard topics to talk about. Students are going through a lot of microaggressions, of a lot of injustices. I went through them. At some point of my life, I was an English language learner, and it's hard for students, especially once we don't see teachers and educators who look like us to motivate us, but rather we see people who sometimes see us as less than or not as smart just because of our color, just because of our language, or of the current living situations that we might be in. So it's important to keep that in mind and remember that, like we keep saying throughout the presentation, Dr. Bianco said it many times, we can't be who we can't see. So let's make sure that we have those people that our students can't see, so to make sure that they know they can be that person.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So now we're going to learn about my passion work. It's a 5-minute video, and then we'll have time for question and answers. Pathways to Teaching, a concurrent enrollment program, started in 2010. And this video will kind of give you an overview. Again, you'll get to hear from some students too.
Today, the majority of kids in our public schools are kids of color, but only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color, and 2% of our teachers are African American males. And we have a pipeline problem, but we also have a retention problem. So, from a district perspective or a school perspective, are there systemic interventions that you think would make a difference? You know, part of what I want to do is I've never been inspired to be a teacher by another teacher of color. Partly because I had like very few of them, but I want to be the teacher of color that, you know, like, oh, we need more teachers of color in the workforce. So it's like, hey, join me. I'm trying.
I was in this class, I realized, okay, I really need to take school seriously because I'm starting to realize that school is so important and I understand why I'm doing things, and now I feel like I have a purpose, and like, I don't know, it was really a game changer that like, so my research project is about the academic effects of high school students who are homeless. Some things in our research is that one of the most vulnerable populations experiencing homelessness is youth and children. They are important to me because I relate to it. My freshman year of high school, I was homeless and going through this. My topic was effective educators.
So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share. And thank you so much, everybody, for your attention. And we have plenty of time, I believe, for questions and answers, but I appreciate your time. And thanks to Jocelyn and New for participating with me today.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Bianco, for that amazing presentation and information. And you know, I know sometimes when you're presenting, it's hard to see in the chat, but lots and lots of love and affirmation and echoing of what you presented. We'd love right now to open it up to any questions that folks have, you know, for Dr. Bianco, for New, as well as for Jocelyn. So I'll open it up. If you have a question, feel free to come off the mic or raise your hand, and we'd love to have them or put them in the chat. While we're waiting, Dr. Bianco, I have a question. You know, you mentioned one of the things that you mentioned is in allyship. And, you know, one of the things we've talked about quite a lot is how you engage the current teacher demographic force to inspire next teacher, you know, and diversify teaching. In your experience, what have some of the best allies done in terms of doing that? Inspiring a more diverse teacher force, you know, despite not being from that particular demographic?
And that's a great question. And actually, that's that conversation where you saw the three young men talking at the table in the video. We also had a conversation about this that day. And one of the things that I said to these young students at the time, you know, Pathways to Teaching was really fairly new. And I said that my initial intention was to have teachers of color teaching in the Pathways to Teaching course. This particular year, we had Lauren Schroff, who was a teacher in Denver Public Schools, who was absolutely amazing. White teacher in her third or fourth year teaching, so she was still fairly new. Students loved her, and that's one of the reasons why I picked her to teach the course. One of the things that students said to me was, Dr. Bianco, you can't just limit the teachers to teachers of color, because in many ways, the white teachers like Ms. Schroff are learning about their own white privilege while they're teaching us, And they have to learn to leave their white privilege at the door, to learn from us and learn from our experiences. So I think for those allies who really want to be true allies, the first thing is to really be a good listener instead of talking, right? So everybody wants to talk. So to be a good listener and listen to your faculty and your teachers of color and your students of color, so that you can help represent their voice, but not speak over them. So as I mentioned, one of the things that I've seen time and again is, you know, my colleagues, my friends around the country who want to be strong allies sometimes assume that their role as a white person with white privilege is to stand in front of me and interpret what I'm saying for the audience. And it's, I don't need you to interpret for me. I know how to speak English. So it's just a matter of standing by my side in solidarity and reinforcing the things that I have to say versus taking over that space. But allyship is important. And I know, Dr. Montoya, we've talked about the fact that the state and the country needs to have better training around what allyship means and how to be a good ally. And that's something I'd love to continue, having conversations with you about.
Yes, appreciate that. Rihanna.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Mestas. Thank you so much, Dr. Bianco and Dr. Montoya, for just holding this space. I'm a PhD candidate in curriculum and instruction at DU, working with Dr. Maria Salazar. So like you were mentioning, just in terms of representation and that mentorship, it is really inspirational to be in the presence, even if it's a virtual presence, of Brown critical scholars. So thank you. So right now I'm working with PEBC as a director of DEI. And part of my job is supporting our teacher candidates. And I am interested in knowing if you could speak, Dr. Bianco, about the process of engaging in an equity audit of the curriculum, or what, any practical experience you have about transforming a curriculum to decenter whiteness has looked like in teacher prep programs.
Yeah, so thank you for that question, and good luck to you in your doctoral program. And you've got a fabulous mentor. I love Dr. Salazar, so she does some fabulous work. So there's lots of work, both, in terms of decentering whiteness in teacher prep curriculum, as well as decentering whiteness in K-12 curriculum or P-12 curriculum too. Equity audits are very important. You don't have to create your own. There are some really good ones out there. I actually have a whole Google folder with equity reports and different resources. And if you send me an email or Dr. Montoya, I'm happy to make that available to anybody who wants it. But there are a number of good equity reports that you can use and modify, right? The other thing, in terms of supporting teachers, Minnesota, believe it or not, Minnesota, which is a state that's whiter than Colorado in terms of our teacher demographics. I think their teacher demographics are something like 96% white teachers, but they are one of the states that I point to that's doing amazing work around supporting the teachers of color that they do have. And one of the things that they've instituted is affinity groups. And so I strongly recommend affinity groups for school districts as one way to give teachers some community, some sense of community and some voice. And then there are national things, and especially now there's all kinds of virtual support groups. There are a number of Facebook groups that are race mentoring centered for junior faculty and for doctoral students. So, I mean, there's a lot of resources that are available that we should take advantage of, because anytime that doctoral students or faculty or teachers have an opportunity to speak and really feel validated, helps give them the energy to continue and move through some of the other obstacles that we face every day. So I hope that answered your question. Jocelyn, maybe you want to speak to what kinds of things we can do in higher ed to support students, undergrad and graduate students, around feeling, welcomed and heard.
Yeah, I think I touched on this before, just having people treating students as like an actual person. I know that sounds really obvious, but sometimes that's what a lot of the programs are lacking, that they just see students as a number rather than actually focusing on their experiences lived and the things that students are going through, and again, touching on those inequalities that they've experienced throughout their K-12 experience. And now going to higher ed, a lot of them are first generation. A lot of them never had a role model help them through this. So just having that support in there, knowing that whatever program you're in, whether it be business, law, education, whatever it might be, that you can go to someone and ask for help and you will be given that help rather than just pushed away.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Tara, and then I'll go to Valerie after that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Tara Mason, and I'm an assistant professor of inclusive education at Western. Dr. Bianco, that was an amazing talk. I really appreciated it. I feel like I learned so much by listening to you. I am a special educator, and I'm very interested in teacher shortage issues for special educators. So I am in the process of writing paraprofessional pipeline grants. And so I was so excited to see all this amazing research coming from you on pipelines, especially paraprofessionals. And so I was wondering, from your perspective, what are some of the things the grants that I'm working on are going to be focused on providing a technology kit for paraprofessionals. They don't typically have technology given to them in school districts for their jobs. And that kind of felt like a barrier that could be potentially, alleviated. And then also training, really supportive, intensive training for mentors and paras. That's the other area that I feel like needs to be addressed. Yeah. What would you suggest? Anything around those two things, or what am I missing?
Yeah, great question. A couple of things. So one of the things that we always have to think about, especially with grants, is how's your program going to be sustainable? So this is our 13th year with Pathways to Teaching, and I've never had a grant. So this is one of the things that I think makes our program different, in terms of, I was very intentional from the beginning to make sure that I wasn't reliant on external funds for a number of reasons. One, I wanted to make sure that we were going to keep going beyond a funding cycle. And two, I didn't want anybody telling me how I spent my money, right? So I didn't want anybody, telling me what I couldn't talk about in order to get this grant. So anyway, really think about sustainability. Two, recognize that any paraprofessional ladder, and so we've got this paraprofessional certificate where students get the 9 credits that can transfer to any of our undergrad teacher prep programs. Then I work with the local districts and the principals to make sure that they can hire our Pathways to Teaching students back. So Jocelyn's a great example in terms of working right away at Lincoln High School as a para while she was doing her undergrad work. So recognize and value the fact that students have to work. So while they're in your program, do they have a job? Or are you providing some kind of, support for them so that they can continue and be successful in your program without having to do your program and work a full-time job, right? So that's why we incorporated that paraprofessional certificate. So Jocelyn can graduate from high school, immediately have a job while she's in her undergrad program, and she's continuing to get the support. Alexis, who you saw in the video, continued to get support after graduation, and we supported her as a first-year teacher. So continued support is huge, making sure that students can work while they're in your program, and then absolutely think through sustainability in a big way, because you could have a great program and then have it die out. So that would be my advice. The training piece is huge. So any teacher that works in Pathways to Teaching goes through a week-long training with me first. So, and I have Jocelyn and New will be participating, but I always have our Pathways to Teaching students help facilitate the training for teachers, because you can't just let somebody loose and make assumptions about what they know and how they're going to portray your program. So one of the things that I'm doing now is, in addition to training Pathways to Teaching instructors, I'm also training instructors around the country just in terms of how do you develop a successful grow your own program? Hope that answered your question.
No, those are great. Thank you so
Good.
much.
Yeah, of course. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mason, and my apologies. I'm trying to navigate like people's titles, so I appreciate that.
No,
And
that's fine. Don't
No,
worry, that's fine.
I'm really insistent on that because far too many cisgendered heterosexual men don't honor that and recognize it. So I want to make sure that I'm not like that.
No worries.
Dr. Sherman, I'm just gonna say it.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to listen and learn from all of you today. I feel like every time, well, I'm just grateful for the opportunity. So my name's Valerie Sherman, and I'm the director of TPREP, which is CU Denver's 2+2 partnerships with a range of community colleges throughout Colorado to bring an ed prep program to them, to individuals living and learning in rural settings, and without expecting them to uproot, relocate, and come and find a higher education experience somewhere around the Front Range. So really my question for everybody that talked today, so that I can continue to listen and learn from you, is really focused in on supports. And you've talked about amazing supports that are part and parcel of your programs. So my question is this: if you could wave a magic wand and there was, so how about this? Maybe it's a two-part question. I'm sorry I do this. So what was one of the most meaningful supports that you received in your journey to where you are now? And then if you could wave a magic wand, what would be something that you hope to receive moving forward that could have a positive impact on what's next for you?
I'm going to turn that over to Jocelyn and New to let them answer. And then Dr. Montoya, if you want somebody else to chime in, but I'm going to let the students speak. Jocelyn, you want to go first this time?
Yes, would you be kind enough to repeat that question one more time?
Happily. So what's been the most meaningful experience, support that you've received, and what's something that you wish you could receive in the future?
Yes, so I think Dr. Bianco and the person that was a GRA at the time, graduate research assistant at the time, when I was a student in high school, they were huge supports for me. They motivated me to do more than just enough. I graduated high school with a year of college credit. I finished my bachelor's in 3 years. I instantly went into my master's program, and it was all because of the support that I received. And I was constantly asking questions. I mean, Dr. Bianco can tell you that I constantly sent her emails about all of these different things, whether I should do this, whether I can do that. What do you think about this? Should I approach it this way? Should I do that way? Just constantly asking for help, because I knew that they were going to be there to help me. If I could, like you said, like a magic wand, and what's for me in the future, as I finish my master's, I will be done with it in May, and I really was looking into an EDD program. And actually, Dr. Montoya, you really motivated me because of that experience that you shared of going right away after your master's. And I've thought about it. I was a little undecisive of whether or not I should do it, just because that lack of experience. But the way you put it, like, you're right, your experience lived, it's experience nonetheless. And so I was really motivated by you. And I think that's what's next in place for me, just getting that done. And the reason why I want to continue into a doctorate degree is because it was rarely the case that I saw a Latina with a doctor in front of it. And I remember when I met Dr. Bianco and I heard Dr. Bianco, Dr. Margarita Bianco, and I thought, that's so powerful, a Latina with a doctor in front of her name. Like, I never thought I could do that. can I do that? And now that I'm close to that, it's like, like I'm almost tearing up just thinking about that 4 years ago, I thought I couldn't, that I was just gonna finish college. And that was even, like my parents came to this country for that, but because of many reasons, sometimes it was a maybe, but then I finished it. Now I'm in my master's program and thinking about going into a doctorate program. It's huge for me, for my family, for my ancestors that couldn't be in this place. And, everything thanks to hearing that Dr. Margarita Bianco, a Latina, that it's doing all of this for students of color. And it's a motivation for sure. I don't know if that answered your question.
You did on every level. Thank you very much, Jocelyn.
So that, Jocelyn just spoke to, you can't be who you don't see, right? So seeing seeing a title in front of my name helped her to start thinking about what that title is going to look like in front of her name very soon. Nu, do you want to add something to that? Are you still with us?
Yeah, I'd love to add on.
Okay.
I think my biggest support for me, on top of Pathways being such a huge support and helping with connections and just resources, was also teachers and administrators at my high school that enabled me to also make changes in programs at my high school. So it was through my senior year, especially through COVID, I was working with my Pathways to Teaching teachers and also my some admin to create a virtual tutoring program for students. And it was just what really helped support me and encourage me was just that they're letting students take the lead and be the change makers and hearing student voice. It was so important that Dr. Bianco said is that the input of student voice, because this is the next generation, and how to add on to changes already being made and changes being made for students of color. It's the inclusion and the participation of students of color in such activities. And the biggest support, or future support, if I can wave a magic wand, is really solidifying and also creating a strong community of teachers of color, faculty of color, and students of color across different schools, just so that students of color and people of color are having spaces where they're able to express themselves, able to share experiences, and also just share knowledges with one another. Like, we're all bringing each other's culture capitals, and just we have strengths to share with one another.
Thank you, Nu. That was great. Appreciate it. And somebody mentioned something about the teacher shortage before. So just quickly, the paraprofessional certificate that we have, the students take 3 courses. The first one is really focused on social justice and having students examine the inequities that exist historically and contemporarily in schools. And then the other 2 courses, one is around multilingual learners and learning about ESL methodology, as well as an introduction to special education. So those 3 courses, I was a para for a number of years while I was in undergrad, and I know that was my gateway to becoming a teacher. And so I want to make sure that the high school students have these courses that prepare them to be a good, effective para educator with a real strength-based, asset-based perspective of students and community. And so we're creating disruptors of educational inequities in introducing them to special ed as well as ESL education, and just a real strong social foundation. So.
Thank you.
Dr. Lane, I think you were going to say something. I saw you raise your hand, so I just wanted to.
I actually just wanted to see if Brianna had anything to add as a grad student and with your work in PEBC about student supports.
So I will echo that our teacher program has implemented student affinity groups as well. And I think one of the challenges that we faced in the past, and even this year from what I'm understanding, the person that's facilitating it, is that BIPOC teachers are very interested, and they're super tapped out. It's an intensive year. And so, the question is, how can we build this into the fabric of the program as opposed to having one extra thing that feels like work for them, an additional sort of lift. That's one thing. I know that in the last year, maybe it's the last 2 years, the program has been able to provide financial support. And that has been, hasn't always been the case in the past, but we have had the funds to provide that. And I know that it makes it much more accessible for teachers to actually participate in the program. Because what we're finding is historically, it's been mostly white teacher candidates and who are either like they have a second hustle, they have another job, they're living with family, perhaps like their partner can support them. It's a big lift. But those are some of the supports that we have, in addition to weekly PLCs or the professional learning communities, the smaller little cohorts that they have that provides that sense of community that could sometimes get lost in larger cohorts. Yeah. And if Lisa Scott is also from PEBC, Lisa, if you have any additional supports that you want to lift up, please feel free to add them.
Any other questions? Well, hearing none now, want to deeply thank you all so much for this amazing opportunity to be here with you all. Thank Dr. Bianco, New, Jocelyn, Dr. Lane, all of you just for this important work. We are committed in the Office of Educational Equity to this work. I'm honored to partner with Dr. Lane in doing this and we also know that we need all the help that we can get. And there is nothing that, that won't be lifted up that we're not going to try to amplify. And if we see things that are working, we're going to continue to do that. So I just want you all to know our deep investment and our commitment to this work. We're looking forward to this week. Please take a look at the various different presentations and please invite as many folks as you can who you think would really benefit and add to those spaces. So Dr. Lane, anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Just thank you both to you, Dr. Montoya and Dr. Bianco.
Thank you all. We have to have a great rest of your week. Looking forward to seeing you in the breakouts.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.